HBO's once acclaimed high fantasy television show turned 10 years old this past April, so this video is a bit late, but I have a feeling that, considering the subject matter, no one will really mind. I figured if there was ever a time that was appropriate to finally give my thoughts on this show I once loved, it would be now, and hopefully I'll never have to discuss it again. A one and done. I want to look back on what gripped me and made me into the passionate fan I used to be, and what the notorious series finale did to basically evaporate any interest I, and a lot of others, had in the property. It's been 2 years since that infamous ending, and honestly, I am still pretty irritated. I know what you might be thinking. Dude, you should get over it. Being angry for this long over a TV show is sad and pathetic. Move on with your life, man. And you're totally right. It is pathetic. But to be completely honest, after investing so much into the show for so long before it became unrepentant trash, I feel pretty entitled to my anger. In fact, part of me even enjoys it, because maybe it's the remnants of my old passion bubbling back up to remind me of how much I used to love the show. And it's a bit life-affirming, you know? I genuinely have never in my entire life experienced such long-term frustration about a piece of media like I have with the Game of Thrones television show. This feeling was totally alien to me until mid-2019. I doubt I have anything particularly new to say that hasn't been said a million times already in the past, and I don't have any interest in being another angry YouTube man, so I don't want any first-time viewers thinking that this is my normal content. But this is something that I've had in the back of my mind for 2 years, and I just want to get it off my chest. There's so much I want to say, and my disappointment runs so deep, I don't even know if I can truly fit every word into this video, no matter how long it may end up being. Because as the months pass, I might think of new things to complain about. But maybe organizing my feelings into a script and committing them to video will assist in the process of getting over it. You would think that the dissatisfaction of something like this would wear off with time, but it's hard to just sweep 8 years of investment under the rug like nothing happened. And I do mean 8 years. I'm one of the 2 million or so people who watched the show on day one, back on April 17th, 2011, and I was enraptured immediately. I admit I had never read the Song of Ice and Fire series, but I did enjoy high fantasy, and the thought of a Hollywood-caliber high fantasy television show on HBO, the network responsible for other modern classics like The Sopranos, The Wire, and others, intrigued me. Even more so when I discovered that it was a story that focused just as much on political intrigue and deception as it did on typical fantasy mysticism. That really piqued my interest, so I tuned in, and I was enamored. The first season was loaded with a huge web of important named characters and tossed more world building at me than I could ever hope to keep up with in one viewing, but I loved it. It was a universe that clearly had a ton of time, thought, and effort put into it, and I really respected that. I was enthralled by it. Characters is quite possibly the strongest point of the whole show. It has a remarkable cast of main and supporting figures with incredible depth, backed up by impeccable acting from names that many of whom were considered nobodies before being cast on the show. Two of the most amazing things Game of Thrones was able to pull off was being able to constantly give viewers hope even in the face of perpetual failure, and drawing out sympathy and understanding from us for some characters who we first thought to be utterly irredeemable. Tyrion Lannister is a very tragic character who suffered from endless ridicule his entire life due to being a dwarf, including from his very own family. His father in particular seemed keen on undermining every single chance at success or happiness Tyrion attempted to seize for himself. However, despite his harsh upbringing, he's an incredibly sharp, witty, and insightful man who is still very capable at using his brilliant mind to get ahead in matters where he can't succeed physically. He continues to endure more tragedy as the show progresses, but even still, in the face of seemingly non-stop deception and death happening around him, we're always given hope that he'll somehow make it to the end. Then you have his brother, Jaime. At the end of the first episode of the show, you're certain he's going to be one of those irredeemable monsters, because we just saw him push a child out of a window to ensure his secret incestuous relationship with his twin sister doesn't get exposed. But as the next several seasons begin to unravel and he separates himself from Cersei and starts to spend time with Brienne of Tarth, something happens that we initially thought impossible. He slowly becomes redeemed. Who we first assumed to be a mustache-twirling nutjob was actually a man with decades of frustration hidden inside of him, and the only one who gave him any semblance of affection was his manipulative, obsessive sister. He never received a single word of thanks for saving hundreds of thousands of lives at the end of Robert's rebellion, because in order to save those lives he had to break the most important oath he had ever taken on, and kill the king he swore to protect. He was a murderous, sadistic psychopath of a king, but the king nonetheless. Due to this, no one gave Jaime credit for his deed, which he did as a teenager, by the way. He's just a king-slaying oathbreaker who can't be trusted anymore, regardless of how many lives he saved in the act. And I could go on and on like this about at least a dozen others if I wanted. It's character arcs like these that truly made Game of Thrones a worthwhile and fulfilling experience, at least for me. The beautiful locales, the awe-striking visuals, the political intrigue and deception, and the striking music were all simply icing on the cake. We saw so many people change and grow over several seasons, we sometimes can't help but look back at how our opinions of those characters may have changed too. And in some cases, the most memorable part of a character's arc is how it comes to an end. Episode 9 of the first season eventually came around, and a ton of viewers who never read the books, me included, witnessed the iconic death of Ned Stark, the presumed main character. It was a pivotal moment in understanding exactly what kind of story this was, an unflinching tale of how greed and unchecked lust for power can further muddy an already volatile political climate to the point where good men aren't even rewarded for being good. In fact, they're actively punished. It was a controversial move to unceremoniously kill off the hero everyone was rooting for, but it was a crucial scene that set the stage for everything else afterward, especially for the Stark children and their respective paths. The books and show continued on, refusing to shy away from the idea that even the characters we were rooting for the most were still human and vulnerable. High fantasy is a widely beloved genre, but for a long time it suffered from giving many of its heroes impenetrable plot armor. A Song of Ice and Fire offered no such protection, and it was almost never meaningless or for cheap shocks. It always led to something that helped the greater plot progress. Since that fateful first day of the show on April 17, 2011, I was a devout fan, and I was also one of the morons who was hopeful that George R.R. Martin would finish his work on the books so the show wouldn't run out of source material by the time it finished. Unfortunately, after 4 amazing seasons, some of the best television ever made quite frankly, the source material more or less ran dry, and David Benioff and D.B. Weiss took it upon themselves to just finish it on their own based on however many vague details George gave them. However, running out of books to follow isn't necessarily the core of the problem. The problem is that David and Dan decided to deviate from them fairly early on, starting at about season 4, maybe 3 if you look hard enough, and trailed off more and more as the series progressed. When the boundaries of the books were no longer there to serve as a general guide, the issue only compounded and became much worse. It's like they wrote themselves into a corner, much like George seems to have done to himself with the books. But instead of taking their time to brainstorm a sensible ending like George seems to be doing, hopefully, they threw their hands into the air and just spat out the first things that came to mind, scene by scene. They just threw shit at a wall, but didn't even take the time to see what stuck. Now, this isn't to say that every scene exclusive to the show is bad. As a matter of fact, there are some scenes in the very first season not present in the books that were brilliant showcases of dialogue and character personalities. For example, there was a very sincere heart-to-heart discussion between Robert and Cersei, where they talk about the enemies of the Seven Kingdoms and the deceit occurring within. Then their own relationship, and they even acknowledge that they honestly don't like each other, yet their marriage is what keeps the realm stable. There's another scene in the same season where Tywin is introduced and lectures Jaime on his recklessness and vanity, and on why it's important for the Lannister name to command respect and maintain a high reputation, all while skinning a stag. These 2 scenes did a remarkable job at offering insight to the personalities of the characters involved, and they were exclusive to the show. Compared to later show-only scenes where characters felt like two-dimensional caricatures of themselves, it begs the question of where this level of depth disappeared to. Game of Thrones eventually came to an end in the 8th season, which was completed on May 19, 2019, just over 2 years ago. Hype and expectations were high, because not only was this the finale of one of the most ambitious and critically acclaimed television shows ever created, it was the only season that had a 2-year gap from its previous one, so people were extra antsy thanks to the wait. And with each passing episode of this conclusive season, more and more people slowly began to realize it was fucking terrible. It didn't even dawn on everyone immediately. Most people didn't truly internalize the shittiness of this season until the credits were rolling on the last episode. But some people had their suspicions as early as the first. It's difficult to quantify and explain every single narrative and creative misstep made by the notorious Season 8, and Season 7 in hindsight, in a quick and concise manner, but it's a list so long, flagrant, and frustrating that the amount of damage it had done to this franchise was irreparable. The phrase cultural phenomenon is probably tossed around a bit more than it should be, but it's a very apt phrase to describe Game of Thrones when it was at its peak. Fan activity, particularly online, was just downright chaotic at times. You could hop on virtually any social media platform and see people discussing the newest episode like they were discussing the weather. Videos on YouTube of people simply reacting to shocking moments got millions of views, and some channels made a name for themselves by offering Game of Thrones-centric commentary. People were cosplaying, making their own handcrafted merch for a living, making food from the show, going on tourism vacations to Ireland. The Game of Thrones fanbase was practically its own damn economy. During the show's fateful final season, it topped out at 19.3 million viewers on the final episode, breaking a ton of viewership records. And this figure doesn't even include the many more people who probably watched in large gatherings. And then there's Piracy, the behemoth that these official figures don't typically account for. Muso, a company that tracks piracy activity, claims that the first episode of Season 8 was pirated 55 million times within the first 24 hours. If we assume each download or view is from one unique person and add those figures together, then Game of Thrones likely had a peak of 70 million fans all around the world. Quite likely even more if we account for those who simply don't watch an episode on the first night. That's a number that only a cultural phenomenon can reach, and yet the silence following the conclusion of the series is deafening. How could such a massive piece of modern media become so painfully irrelevant so quickly? How could so much acclaim, respect, and admiration just vanish into thin air? Turns out the answer is to simply waste every modicum of potential it has and go out of your way to ensure it crashes and burns in the ugliest incident you can organize. You take a bunch of fascinating characters, concepts, and subplots and find a way to ignore or ruin them without a shred of shame. I must have read dozens of fan theories between 2011 and 2018 that were orders of magnitude better than the tripe ending we actually got. Turns out Jon Snow being the true heir to the Iron Throne meant nothing in the long run. Turns out Bran learning how to be a mind-controlling, time-traveling tree wizard also didn't amount to much, yet he still becomes king in the end because he, quote, has the best story? Turns out Jaime distancing himself from Cersei because she's a total psychopath was just him going through a midlife rebellious phase that would be totally undone. Turns out the Night King and his army of undead were actually the biggest fucking pushovers imaginable, failing to take over any noteworthy settlements or towns, and getting defeated in a single night despite having a zombie ice dragon on their side. Oh, and Azor Ahai? Never heard of him. Varys went out like a chump, Tyrion got flanderized into the resident quip spouter and dick joke maker, Jon Snow became a glorified side character, Jaime's multi-season redemption arc was entirely for nothing, and Euron Greyjoy was just chaotic, evil, dollar store Jack Sparrow who inspired more groans than fear. And then there's characters who went out before Season 8, but still left us in ways that were complete antitheses to their personalities. I'm still pissed off about Barristan Selmy. he went out like a loser, totally against the badass image he rightfully gained over his years in the Kingsguard. And both David and Dan went out of their way to publicly mock the actor, Ian McElhenney, for rightfully questioning the direction of his storyline.
Yeah, and there's a, before we deliver the scripts to actors who are going to perish in that script, we make the phone call, which has become kind of a tradition, and it's not that much fun. But usually, people are quite gracious about it and everything. And this year, for the first time, we got some pushback where the actor said, "You sure about that?"
Guess who it is? When you watch the season, guess who it is?
And we said, "Yeah, no, we're quite sure you are going to die this year." And so there was a long conversation. Then we got a long letter explaining why this was a bad idea, which just made us want to kill that person that much more. So,
Littlefinger also died while being made into a total idiot who apparently didn't know how to play the Game of Thrones at all, and got effortlessly outwitted by 2 teenage girls with less than a quarter of his political experience. Oh, and remember Mira Reed, who dragged Bran's crippled ass all over Cold Creation? Daughter of the last living man who knew Jon's parentage? No? Guess she was just a fever dream, because I could have sworn that was something important. Characters were stripped of their depth and turned into cardboard cutouts, often becoming a walking trope that acted a specific way or said a specific thing all the time, because that was the only personality trait the writers knew how to highlight, and this is assuming the character wasn't tossed away and forgotten about entirely. If I were to give a quick example of how badly the season flubbed everything regarding its writing, then I would like to bring your attention to a fellow named Matt Easton, who is best known for his YouTube channel, Scala Gladiatoria, where he provides educational videos detailing the history of weapons and warfare. Before the episode featuring the Battle of Winterfell aired, he published a video detailing how the human army should fight, providing a series of perfectly valid and reasonable battle tactics that are grounded in reality, based off of battles that occurred throughout history. And guess what? The show did the total opposite of basically every single thing he said. Matt said there was no point in anyone being outside the walls, but the show started the battle with everyone outside the walls, and even going so far as to basically sacrifice the Dothraki for a dumb charge that just looks cool on camera. Matt said that it would be very silly to put people underground in the crypts where the dead bodies are, but the show does exactly that, and surprise, the dead bodies came alive. Matt said that the majority of the human forces should focus on using arrows to defend the fort from a safe distance, but there were barely any archers to be seen throughout the whole battle. They had the manpower to mine truckloads of dragonglass, but didn't think to make more bows, and the list goes on and on. The mediocrity of the battle is doubly more frustrating when you consider the fact that the show has had multiple fantastic battles in previous seasons, the Battle of Blackwater, Hardhome, and the Battle of the Bastards, all of which were critically acclaimed sequences that didn't suffer anywhere near as much scrutiny despite having less hype. It's even more baffling when you remember that those last 2 episodes I just named were also directed by Miguel Sapochnik, the director of the Battle of Winterfell. The shittiness of Season 8 also shined a light on how bad Season 7 was too, with its weird fast-traveling and idiotic plan to go capture a white. Seasons 5 and 6 were also retroactively criticized more. At the time they were first airing, fans acknowledged their weird or questionable narrative missteps. Seemingly important plot threads were abruptly ended with little payoff or explanation, and that's if they weren't outright ignored. But we gave them a pass at the time because we all thought the show was leading up to something, a big, worthwhile payoff that would satisfy us. We thought things were happening. We assumed that they were a sign that the big conclusion was coming, and the sudden ends of these subplots would converge into something grand and spectacular. Seasons 5, 6, and 7 could be as horrible as they wanted to be as long as Season 8 delivered. So much for that. We ignored the writing on the wall that tried to warn us that the show was crashing and burning, because we were fooled into thinking that the flames were fireworks, and not the engines of the plane we were in. I would probably wager a bet that tossing away a dozen or so subplots to lessen the load of writing work for the next 2 seasons was the entire point of Cersei blowing up the Sept with a ton of important supporting characters in it. Even if it does end up happening again in the books, the consequences of that event will at least be real and substantial there. And yes, some people still hold out for George finishing the books, but the monumental delay for the Winds of Winter is slowly sapping the passion out of some fans, and I don't blame them. The longer they have to sit around and twiddle their thumbs in anticipation for the next entry, the better it needs to be to justify the decade-long wait. But we'll talk about that more in a bit. Game of Thrones' footprint in popular culture has been seemingly filled in. No former fan wants to discuss this show anymore. No potential new viewers show any sincere interest. Now it's just morbid curiosity, like hearing about a dead body being found in a nearby alley and you want to go see if it's still there so you can poke it with a stick. I used to recommend this show to others, actively. Every season for the first 4 seasons or so, I would go out of my way to tell people that it was only getting better, and that now was the best time to get on the hype train. Turns out that was just me setting myself up to be partially responsible for the crushing disappointment of others. Worst part is, the terrible final season also murdered the show's rewatchability. I wish I could say that I went back and rewatched the whole series as research for this video, but fuck that. I don't need to. It's not just the feeling of disappointment itself that's branded into my mind, but the memories related to the things I'm disappointed about are also there. This isn't the kind of show where each season has its own contained narrative so you can easily ignore the worst ones. The entire show has one long, huge, dense overarching plot, and its longevity in the eyes of fans and popular culture completely hinges on whether it sticks the landing or not. And it didn't. It's basically a 73-hour-long movie that completely drops the ball with only 4 hours left. I don't need to rewatch Season 8 to recall the horrendous 3rd episode that slowly made me realize this series finale was going to be shit. I already went into detail about the hilariously botched attempts at military strategy, but the Battle of Winterfell was also hyped up to rival the likes of the Battle of Helm's Deep in The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, which is now just blasphemy in retrospect. It didn't even come close to offering the same experience that Peter Jackson offered 19 years ago. Worse still, despite this episode, this battle, specifically being anticipated for 8 years, it didn't even have the balls to kill off anyone really important. Instead, it gave us fake-out deaths of Brienne, Jaime, and Sam, while only killing Theon and Jorah. And to top it all off, it isn't even Jon who finally delivers the killing blow to the Night King and ends the battle like we all expected. It's Arya, who is quite possibly the least deserving of that moment, as I'm pretty sure she didn't even know about the Night King and Whites until she arrived back in Westeros after her Faceless Men training. It was so remarkably unearned, and the unease struck me the moment I saw it. When Arya's blade went into the Night King's cold, icy liver, I wasn't hype. I wasn't relieved. I was just perplexed. And the decision to give this kill to her finally made sense when I saw the interviews with David and Dan, and their reasoning for it is literally just, it's cool because no one will expect it.
For, I think it's probably 3 years now or something, we've known that it was going to be Arya who delivers that fatal blow.
She seemed like the best candidate, provided we weren't thinking about her in that moment. One of the great things about having this many people you care about in a sequence together is that you can kind of pull people's attention and focus to people that they care about a lot, like Jon and like Dany, Theon and Bran, not to mention Tyrion and Sansa and the Crypt. So you're going all over the place with people who you're desperately worried for, and hopefully you forget about the fact that Arya Stark ran out of that castle with the battle drums playing and going towards some purpose, and we don't know what until it happens.
We hope to kind of avoid the expected, and Jon Snow has always been the hero, the one who's been the savior, but it just didn't seem right to us for this moment.
This is how the idea of subverting expectations became something that caused a bitter, disgusting taste to form in people's mouths when they hear the phrase. David and Dan spat in the face of years worth of foreshadowing and carefully placed clues and purposefully ignored the ending everyone expected, yet wanted, just so they could get a cheap, momentary surprise. It wasn't about having a sensible ending for them. It was about giving the audience a totally isolated moment that shocked them, meant to make viewers go, "Whoa, that's crazy." David and Dan wanted to turn the final season into a giant highlight reel of cool moments instead of investing storytelling, even though people would inevitably rub their brain cells together and realize how awful it is in hindsight. They threw out everything just to get undeserved reactions of shock, ones that would eventually fade away and be replaced with befuddlement and disgust at how much of a poorly planned conclusion this all was. And this approach wasn't even necessary because the plot, as it was presented in the books, translated to a ton of incredibly shocking moments regardless. Ned Stark's execution, the Red Wedding, Joffrey's death, Oberyn's death, and more were all plenty memorable and still served the progress of the story well. So yeah, I don't need to rewatch Season 8 as research or something because I remember some of its worst aspects pretty fucking clearly despite not watching a single second of the show in the last 2 years. The process of editing this video is the first time I've had Game of Thrones footage playing on any screen that I own since May 19th, 2019. I know for a fact that I'm not the only one who dropped this show cold turkey after that last season. How else did the fanbase disintegrate into nothing so damn quickly? It was a finale so destructive to everything the series created beforehand, the entire show will be remembered first and foremost for how badly it fucked everything up, and then for how good the first 4 seasons were, followed by the bitter realization that they are still worthless because of the botched ending. All in that order. Even people who were never interested in the show are aware of how terrible Season 8 is. It's the ultimate deterrent. Since the end of Season 8, I've seen nobody try to organize some sort of big rewatch party, remotely or otherwise. I've seen very few people proudly show off their merchandise, cosplay, or paraphernalia. I can only imagine how many billions of dollars in licensing deals were left on the table as a direct result of the incendiary reception to the final season, because no noteworthy licensed media has come out since the conclusion of Season 8, except for one free-to-play video game in November 2019, meaning it was close to completion as Season 8 was airing anyway. The 2 upcoming shows are the only things that I'm aware of. We're still going through a 1.5-year-long global pandemic that had damn near every human being trapped inside their homes for much longer than usual, and I personally haven't seen anyone on social media, even in passing, mention that they are watching or rewatching the show. Now obviously, the world is big, and I'm sure there's tons of separate people isolated from online discourse taking their own time to finally give it a shot now that it's completed. I'm not denying that. But the active, bustling internet fanbase Game of Thrones used to have in its heyday is just gone. No one talks about the show with fondness anymore. They only talk about it as some sort of cautionary tale about how producers who lose interest in or sight of what made their show great in the first place can ruin it in the long run. I used to be that zealous fan who constantly recommended that people watch it, probably to the point where I would be annoying. But now I'm the regretful former fan who is imploring everyone to avoid it. Or if they need to experience the story, then I suggest just reading the books, no matter how painful or potentially unending the wait for the next one may be. And speaking of the books, where are they? I know George has a lot on his plate trying to untangle the sprawling narrative he sort of wrote himself into a corner with that spans a massive world and dozens of important named characters with and without their own point of view chapters. But why is it taking over 10 years to do it? Worse still is the reminder that this decade-long wait isn't even for the last book in the saga, it's for the second to last. It's clear that George is a perfectionist and would want to offer as perfect of an experience as possible, and I appreciate that. But unless he's juggling both, and the 7th book comes out immediately after the 6th as a huge surprise, I have doubts about him finishing it. Some people have stopped caring partially due to the wait, and partially due to the show killing their passion in this universe. But the books are the last glimmer of hope for this massive story. The people who are left and actually anticipating these tomes want their hatred of the show's ending to be validated by George himself in giving everyone a conclusion that's actually sensible. Again, I admit that I haven't read the books yet, because, frankly, I assumed the show would have done a good job at adapting them, and it did up to a certain point. But there is the question of if the show's ending is related to the books in some way, because supposedly George told David and Dan the ending to his saga back in 2014, and in 2019, before the final season started airing, George said he doesn't believe their ending would be different from his. However, the show has made some incredibly drastic deviations from the source material starting as early as Season 4. A lot of details will be different, sure, but will George's ending still have John fuck back off to the north and his lineage mean nothing? Danny going insane in the most unceremonious way imaginable? Jamie throwing his search for redemption away and running back to the manipulative, psychopathic sister he purposely left? And what about Bran becoming the king? There's probably still room for the book's plot to still shift to these results, and this is ultimately the detail that scares people. At the very least, George could build up and explain these things adequately enough to make us reluctantly accept it, instead of hastily shoving them in our face with only minimal or even nonsensical reasoning. Thankfully, he's already given us some reassurance that things will be different, such as Littlefinger not giving Sansa over to Ramsay, for example. But that doesn't really matter if the final product never actually reaches people's hands. I know there's absolutely an argument to be made that he's taking his time to ensure we receive top-notch material, and that may very well end up being true, which is appreciated. But the worryingly long amount of time has given rise to a lot of doubt. Other writers have managed to churn out dense, long, and equally or nearly equally compelling narratives in the time it's taken George to write The Winds of Winter. For example, James S.A. Corey is the pseudonym of two writers, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. Between June 2011 and right now, they've released 8 full-length novels for the Expanse series, with a 9th coming out later this year. In that same window of time, George has only given us A Dance with Dragons in July 2011. Of course, they're different stories in different genres, and I am comparing the work of 2 people working together to the work of 1 person working alone. But you get what I'm saying here. I'm not going to judge the quality of a book that's not even out. I'm just saying that a decade-long wait doesn't actually inspire much confidence. Because contrary to what some people may think, time doesn't always equal quality. I play a lot of video games, so I am painfully aware of this fact. There have been plenty of disappointments in every industry that were in the works for a long time, and still ended up subpar despite that additional effort. Like, the extra year it took to make Season 8 of the show. And finally, there's the topic of the future for the franchise. As I'm making this video, there's 2 spin-off television shows currently in the works. The first is House of the Dragon, which is based on the content of the Fire and Blood book and centers around the Targaryen family 300 years before the events of Game of Thrones. The second spin-off is The Tales of Dunk and Egg, another prequel set only about 90 years before Game of Thrones, centering around the adventures of Duncan the Tall and Aegon Targaryen. The former is further along in development, but still won't air until 2022. And the latter is very, very early, still without a writer or any talent attached as far as I know. I fully acknowledge that these shows are their own entities and David and Dan thankfully have no role in them, so they have a chance at being good. But god damn is it still so fucking hard to work up any sort of interest for them, especially since The Tales of Dunk and Egg is also unfinished. And, to be honest, as I look around popular social media platforms, the general hype surrounding these upcoming shows just seems tepid at best, especially when compared to the peak of Game of Thrones fanbase activity. I know that it's possible for spin-off content to more or less save an intellectual property. Hell, that's what happens with Star Wars all the fucking time. The movies disappoint a portion of the fanbase, and it's the novels, comics, games, and shows that scoop that lost interest back up. But Star Wars had decades of multimedia expanded universe content already out before it needed any sort of saving. Game of Thrones had, aside from its source material, just a handful of spin-off novels, novellas, companion guides, and a card game, some board and tabletop games, and several mostly forgettable video games. The Game of Thrones IP just didn't have the safety net of an immense expanded universe to fall back on and catch the people who fell off from the show. In fact, it didn't even have completed source material to begin with. Even if it was at the risk of being too soon and looking too greedy, HBO should have greenlit a spin-off or two while Game of Thrones was still airing. Preferably starting immediately after Season 4. They could have easily aired during the mid to late fall, right between new seasons of Game of Thrones. But hindsight is 2020, and I'm sure they figured they wouldn't need such a security measure, and I don't blame them. Game of Thrones absolutely seemed like the kind of show that was too big and sturdy to fail, until it did. The complete and utter disappearance of Game of Thrones from popular culture is astounding. I can scarcely think of any other type of media that just burst onto the scene with so much fire and hope for the future, then peak at an Olympic high to the point where almost every episode felt like a major event, yet still managed to end in the ugliest manner imaginable, so unrepentant in the waste of its own talent and potential that it was followed by a silence so distinct it was as if the tens of millions of former fans somehow came to a unanimous agreement to just never talk about it again. Other shows in the past have had some god-awful endings. Lost, Dexter, How I Met Your Mother, 2.5 Men, and more. I've seen a couple of them. And in Lost's case, I've seen some people even try to defend it. But the repercussions of Game of Thrones ending the way it did isn't just a sad finale to one show. It's a mark of death for a franchise that could have gone on to be comparable to the aforementioned Star Wars in popularity, multimedia dominance, and revenue. It could have spawned endless, expanded universe-like content across all forms of entertainment. I would have loved to play a video game like Knights of the Old Republic, but set in the Game of Thrones world. I bet a game like that would have been fucking awesome, but now it'll probably never happen. Then there's the more obvious comparison to another high fantasy intellectual property, Lord of the Rings, which, admittedly, does have the advantage of being long finished before the famous film trilogy came out. But since the conclusion of those movies, there's been plenty of other media that hasn't come close to capturing the same amount of magic and amazement. But in the face of one piece of disappointing superfluous media after another, the Lord of the Rings trilogy remains to live on as a media milestone, guaranteeing that Middle-earth will always stay relevant to pop culture. Fans are anticipating the upcoming series with Amazon with the participation of the Tolkien estate, which is to take place thousands of years before The Hobbit. But even if that ends up being a letdown, or, God forbid, just outright awful, we can still fall back onto the safety net of the films and the completed literary works. As a matter of fact, that already kinda happened. The Hobbit trilogy is quite widely considered to be a disappointing follow-up to the original trilogy, despite being directed by the same man, though admittedly there were a lot of complications preceding Jackson's involvement as director. These films have been subject to many fan edits attempting to cut them down to something closer to its source material, but its divisive existence didn't retroactively ruin the greatness of The Lord of the Rings, which is still watched and actively adored by many, including me, totally divorced from the taint of any other lackluster pieces of Middle-earth multimedia. And then, of course, there's the idea of HBO redoing Season 8 entirely, which obviously isn't going to happen, but for the sake of discussion, what if they were open to it? Let's say every actor was miraculously willing to return. What then? The big issue is that to make Season 8 better, you would have to not just redo it, but also expand it to a full 10 episodes, and likely tack on another full season of 10 after that. because in that time frame in universe, the show tries to cover what is essentially two major conflicts, and the terrible pacing of the 6 episodes we got makes it feel like everything happens within a few days. In the most severe case, if HBO truly wanted to nip in the bud as many problems as they can, they'd have to redo Season 7 and split that into 2 as well. In the early years of the show, HBO actually wanted it to go for up to 10 seasons, which would have been perfect. If Seasons 7 and 8 had 10 episodes and we had 2 more full seasons after that, we would have gotten an extra 27 episodes in total, which would have been more than enough to give a satisfying conclusion. But no, we were denied that because apparently David and Dan always intended on 7 or 8 seasons, despite the waning quality of the writing suggesting they should change their minds since Season 5. I can only imagine that there's some universe or timeline out there where Game of Thrones ended well, and possibly even side by side with the books. Maybe the show was a full 10 seasons, with 1 or 2 separate rest years to give George extra time on the books, which released in a timely manner and were just as good as everyone hoped. It's nice to think about, but sadly, we don't live in that universe. We live in the one where the opposite of all of that happened. George is taking his sweet time, the show overtook the source material and ended in a way that clearly didn't match the quality of preceding seasons, and a decade after the release of A Dance of Dragons, we still don't even have a release window for The Winds of Winter. Hopes have been dashed, tons of potential was left unrealized, and expectations were subverted in the worst manner imaginable. If I had the ability to isolate the first 4 seasons of the show from the latter 4, then I'd still be able to enjoy the best period of the show's existence. But it's extremely difficult to do that when you already know how much you hate the ending those seasons eventually lead to. The cataclysmic ruining of the show caused by Season 8 has changed the discourse surrounding it forever. Game of Thrones is now something that people derive more entertainment in verbally thrashing than they do actually watching. Even if the finale was terrible and destructive of such a huge legacy, hating it with others sure is fun in its own right, even if that hate stems from a deep, deep sense of disappointment. For the last 2 years, the most fascinating thing about the show now is its remarkably quick disappearance from relevancy. I think that's more or less everything I wish to say about the fate of Game of Thrones. It's been 2 years of holding these thoughts in, so maybe putting them on video will help me finally get over it. It took a long time to get this video out because I kept going back to the script and adding more and more and more, because it turns out I had a lot to say that wasn't immediately apparent to me when I first started writing. As I said near the beginning of the video, I've never felt this level of frustration over a piece of media before, and I've been disappointed a lot in my life, including by other things I've waited years for. This was a totally alien feeling to me until the end credits started to roll on that last episode. I don't know if I'll watch House of the Dragon when it's out, but at least it's based on completed source material, so it has that going for it. If you stuck around and watched this whole video up until this point, I'm sorry for probably boring you with things you probably already knew or feelings you already had, but I appreciate your time regardless. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.